assimilation and pluralism. And we're also, and the way we're going to do with that is by talking about European immigration. The reason we're going to tackle European immigration first is because right now, at this point in time, Europeans are the dominant group in the United States. They have the most people, and they seem to be in charge of a lot of different things like companies and whatnot. So we're going to talk about European immigration. I want you to think about Europeans, and part of the problem that we have when we're dealing with the concept of European Americans or white people is that we think of them as this nebulous group of individuals. But the reality is that Europeans, just like different indigenous groups, just like Hispanic groups, they aren't the same. They're not. They're not similar. They don't have to be similar. So we're going to talk about the different groups today, so that you get an idea of what we're talking about. Just like, I mean, if somebody thinks that all American Indians are the same, you can obviously tell them, no, that's not true at all. We're not anything like the Hopi. We're not anything like the Lakota or Nakota or Dakota. We're not anything like the Blackfeet. Cheyenne are completely different than us. Comanches, my goodness, they all live in Oklahoma. So you know, the white people are exactly the same. And one of the things we're going to learn is that most most of the white people that you potentially run into, about 60% of them, their ancestors didn't come here until the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. 60% of all immigration took place between 1880 and 1920. And you know, that's a lot. That's an awful lot of people. Anyway, we're going to get into that in just a second. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, this is chapter 3 in the Healy book. We need to define what assimilation is first. Assimilation is the process by which a distinct and separate group begins to share a common culture with another group and begins to merge socially. And of course, this hasn't always happened in the United States. Sometimes people are different, and it takes them one or two generations before they meld in to the other people around them. Pluralism exists when groups maintain their individual identities, and that's known as pluralism. It's also known as multiculturalism, where you support each culture and allow them to have their own culture. I mean, it wouldn't. You would certainly be upset if somebody came in and told you that you couldn't practice any of your ceremonies anymore, and you couldn't refer to yourself as Dene. That happened to in the Spanish-speaking countries in South and Central America. That happened quite a bit. So people lost their identity as to what group they were a part of, or who their ancestors were. They just lost it. It's no longer there, and that's one of the reasons why there are only certain groups who were isolated who still know what their original group was. A good example of assimilation deals with the Vikings. In 840, an army of Danes attacked the most powerful country in Europe, which was France at the time, and they sacked Paris by sailing up the Seine River. Paris is about 120 miles from the coast, so they started in Denmark. They came around through the North Sea into the English Channel, and then they sailed up the Seine River for about 120 miles until they came to Paris, and they sacked the city of Paris. This is in 840. Over the next 70 years, the Vikings would periodically sail up the Seine and sack Paris. No French army could defend against their lightning attacks and hit and run tactics. Around 900, a Viking army built a permanent settlement at the mouth of the Seine River into the English Channel. The French could not dislodge them. Charles III of France resolved the dilemma by inducing the Viking leader Roland to ally himself with France and guard the mouth of the Seine from other Viking raiders. The area settled by Roland came to be known as Normandy because they were Normans. They were Vikings who were from the north, Norsemen, Normans, and the Vikings allowed themselves to be christened. And so, whereas before they worshipped Odin and Valhalla, now suddenly they were Christians. They had become Christians. They adopted the language of the French instead of the Danish language. They adopted the culture of the French. So all of a sudden, 900 A.D., these guys became literally they became French because they adopted the French language and they adopted the French culture and they adopted the French religion. And this is a form of assimilation, of course. When the Normans invaded England in 1066, the Normans had lost all the semblance of their Viking past and brought the French language and customs to England. Complete French assimilation took just over 100 years, despite the distance between Normandy and Paris, about 120 miles. So despite the fact that Paris was so far away, the people that lived in Normandy adopted the French language and the French culture and the French religion. Assimilation can be accomplished in several different ways. One means of assimilation is a form of referred to as the melting pot. And of course, if you've ever seen, what is that television show that used to be on Saturday mornings? Education Rock, something like that. Anyway, they used to talk about the melting pot all the time. Probably if you've read American history, you know, in the fourth grade, you had history class, and they talked about the United States being a melting pot. In this type of assimilation, different groups contribute roughly equal amounts of their culture to the new society. The melting pot metaphor sees assimilation as benign and egalitarian due to the sharing of cultures and the inclusion of all. But this is not the American experience. This isn't the way it worked. People were not treated, everybody wasn't treated equally. And the culture that developed was primarily English, but there were other groups that gave us part of what the American culture is. A good example would be Christmas. Christmas, of course, is a Christian religion, but at the same time, the Christmas tree and some of the Christmas carols are German, are very German, actually. You know, sometimes other things are adopted. But this vision of welcoming of immigrants into the fabric of American society is true for very few groups. People of different races and countries of origin suffered serious prejudice and discrimination. Assimilation in the United States was often coercive and focused on contorting people into the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant mold that prevailed in early America. So it was the white Anglo-Saxon has to do with being from England. So they were trying to force people to act like white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, WASPs. They wanted everybody to conform, to change, to be like them, to go to church the same way they did, to talk the same way they did. They were trying to force assimilation on people. This forced conformity was often referred to as Americanization or Anglo-conformity. Assimilation has taken the form of forcing new citizens to speak English and adjust to the British style of institutional patterns. Groups from different parts of Europe had greater success assimilating to the American fabric because of their familiarity with English, cultural characteristics, and higher levels of education. Immigrants from the United Kingdom and Ireland were more successful than those from Eastern and Southern Europe, mainly because they already spoke English, so they could interact with the dominant population, which was the Anglo-Saxons at the time. and they didn't have any problem because they already spoke the language. And they already understood the culture, especially if they came from the United Kingdom. But not that many people came from the United Kingdom. A lot of people came from Ireland, and tons of people came from Germany, came from Western Europe, the French, the Germans, the Italians, Greeks, and we're going to talk about all of these groups and how many of them came into the United States in just a moment. Pluralism is when the group is able to maintain their culture and identify an identity within a larger dominant society. This they are able to maintain over time. Wisconsin professor Horace Kalin first purported the concept of pluralism in 1915. And you'll have to remember that in 1915, there were a lot of people in the United States who were still assimilating to the American way of life. A Jewish immigrant from Eastern Germany, Kalin felt that a democracy like the United States should be able to support many different cultures without the use of Anglo-conformism assimilation, no matter the religion, culture, or language. And one of the things that you need to remember is that he was Jewish. So he, and of course, the American ideal was white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. He was not Protestant, obviously. He was Jewish. He was not Anglo-Saxon either. He was German. But he was white. And that is one of the things that he'll talk about. Kalin saw the United States as a federation of diverse groups rather than Anglo-centric vision that came out of the East Coast. Being an immigrant himself and then teaching in a newly settled area away from the East Coast, Kalin saw the Scandinavian and German farmers amalgamating easily into the Wisconsin fabric with their culture intact. And if you go to Wisconsin today, you see exactly the same thing. Strong German and Scandinavian cultures up there. It's a little bit different than the East Coast. And for that reason, of course, Kalin felt that it was possible, pluralism was possible in the United States. And actually, when we think about it, and if you understood what was going on, as you moved across the United States, different villages, different towns would be German. Some of them would be Scandinavian. Some of them would be French. Some would be English. And they would have one or two dominant churches in the towns. So if you're Scandinavian and you move to Kansas, you'd move to Swedetown, or a town that had almost all people from Sweden in it. Or you might move to the next town over, which was mostly Norwegian. Or you might move to the town 50 miles to the north of you, and that would be German. And so if you were German, you'd move to the German town. If you were Swedish, you'd move to the Swedish town. And if you were Norwegian, you moved to the Norwegian town. That's the way it happened all the way across the United States. And still today, you can go to places like, well, I live in Iowa. One of the major areas in Iowa is a town called Pella. And Pella was settled by the Dutch. And now, even to this day, they are primarily Dutch, living, or of Dutch ancestry, living in that town. And they have Dutch festivals every spring. I think, yeah, they have. It's in the spring. There's also a Dutch town just on the other side of the Mississippi River. Fulton is a Dutch town, and they actually have a Dutch windmill in their town. It's a lot of interesting things going on. So as we were moving across the United States, as the European populations were moving across the United States, they were pretty much settling with the people that they were used to, people that spoke their own language, and a lot of that had to do with religion, because they wanted a church. They wanted to be able to go to a church that where they were used to worshiping. So if they were German, they would either be Catholic or Lutheran. If they were Scandinavian, they were probably Lutheran. Um, the and I well, I haven't told you guys this, but the town that I lived in, where I went to high school or grade school and high school, was a place called Daleville, and Daleville was Methodist. It had a German Methodist church. It had an American Methodist church, and it had an English Methodist church. It had a Wesleyan church, Church of EUB Church, Evangelical United Brethren, which was the Methodist church of the Germans. So if you were a German Methodist, then you went to the EUB Church. If you were an English Methodist, you went to the Wesleyan Church. And if you had been in the United States for an extended length of time, you would go to the American Methodist Church, all in the same village. It was all in the same town. It wasn't a very large town, but you had three choices as to what type of Methodist church you could go to, as interesting as that is. And it was that way all the way across the United States, into the Great Plains, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri. So if you wandered into a town in Missouri, potentially they were Methodist, and you were Methodist, it was almost like going home, I guess, for you, because they would be, they'd go to church. They might be Germans just like you, or they might be English just like you. Anyway, that's the way it worked. Whether it was because of the Anglo-centric mindset of the East Coast or the cultural necessity of assimilating the massive immigrants in the Boston and New York City areas, Kalin's pluralism took a long time to be accepted as an acceptable alternative to Anglo-conformism assimilation. And if you go to Boston, even today, the Boston Brahmins, the reason they're called Brahmins is because they are the leaders of the town. They are still Puritan. They're still that type of, they're Calvinists. They have those types of ideas. New York City was settled by the Dutch initially, and the people that were the leaders in that city were primarily they were Episcopalian, and I can remember reading in history books about the first Catholic mayor of New York. It was a mayor in the 1920s, Mayor LaGuardia. And of course, there's an airport named after LaGuardia because suddenly the immigrants had taken over the politics from the Protestants. But since the Civil Rights Act in 1965 and all the turmoil that led up to it, a pluralistic attitude has been more popular in the United States. And of course, there's another name for pluralism, and that is multiculturalism. But despite the advent of pluralism and the expanding diversity of people coming into the United States, white ethnic movements and English-only attitudes maintain a strong base. And of course, some people think that English is the official language of the United States. It isn't. As a matter of fact, if you go to court and you don't speak English, then they have to provide an interpreter for you in your own language. English is not the official language of the United States, despite the fact that from time to time, politicians will try to get that law passed, that English is the official language of the United States. Whoops, sorry. Multiculturalism is a form of pluralism that stresses mutual respect for all groups and acceptance that multiple heritages formed the United States. And that's what I've been talking about. Cultural pluralism is a state where a minority group has not acculturated to the dominant group. Thus, the minority group is able to maintain their own customs and identity. And that's primarily what has happened with the Dene people. American Indians, in most cases, have been able to achieve cultural pluralism by living with the dominant culture but maintaining their culture and language through cultural events such as powwows. And of course, powwows are very popular in The northern United States, not so popular in the South. I guess you guys have that big powwow in Albuquerque every year. The Amish have been able to achieve cultural pluralism by rejecting many of the conveniences of the dominant culture and living a simpler agrarian lifestyle. Structural pluralism is a situation where the minority group has acculturated to the dominant group but has not been integrated into the society. And this is a lunch counter in Alabama where they were trying to integrate the lunch counter, and the people were so upset that they poured milkshakes on the two African Americans and the one white gentleman that was trying to integrate the lunch counter. A good example of structural pluralism is the Jewish situation during much of their time in the United States. While Jewish leaders were accepted as community leaders, businessmen, and bankers, they were excluded from joining many exclusive Christian clubs around the country. And these were country clubs, and for some reason they decided that Jewish people could not be members of those clubs because they had to believe in Christ or something. I'm not exactly sure how they stated it, but even to this day there are some country clubs, some golf clubs, some fraternities, some groups that will not allow Jewish people in their club. Another example of structural pluralism is the abundance of churches of the same faith within common areas. For example, Omaha, Nebraska, with a population of 390,000 people, has a total of 22 Catholic churches, each serving different ethnic groups. When we lived in the Omaha area, it was kind of interesting. I coached a high school soccer team, boys soccer team, and we would play all of the different Catholic schools, and I didn't understand. I'm not real bright, so I didn't really understand what was going on. Why in the world would we play Cathedral, and then we would go and play Creighton Prep or Roncalli? Why in the world were there all of these different Catholic schools? And the answer was because some were Irish Catholic, some were Italian Catholic. There was Slovenian Catholic and Slovakian Catholic. Who else was there? There was Czech, and the Czechs didn't like the Slovaks. And it was just really kind of bizarre that all of these different groups had their own church, and they were all the same denomination. That was the strange part. Anyway, so it was kind of interesting. Mount Michael was another one. So yeah, we played against all those schools, and to this day I'm not exactly sure whether Cathedral was Italian or Irish or whatever, but I know that Mount Michael was Irish. Anyway, not important. Another type of pluralism is where the minority group is integrated into the society without becoming acculturated to the dominant culture. This occurs in two different configurations: enclave minorities and middlemen minorities. Enclave minorities establish their own neighborhoods supported primarily by their own businesses. Chinatowns on the east and west coast are good examples of enclave communities. Little Havana in South Florida is another example. Middlemen minorities are similar to enclave communities, but they are more spread out over larger areas. Korean convenience stores in Los Angeles are a good example. Asian Indian-owned motel chains are another example. Often enclave and middlemen minorities are successful because of the support they get from their own communities. This is part of the success story of Jewish immigrants to the United States, who were able to succeed in ghetto circumstances because of intercommunity support. Pluralism and assimilation aren't the only possible goals that a minority group relationship might have with a dominant group. Separation is the political, cultural, and geographic severing of ties between groups. Revolution is the overthrowing of the dominant group by the minority group, therefore replacing them in power. American Indians fought from the beginning of European incursion until the end of the 19th century to establish themselves as autonomous. Since then, the goal has been to separate themselves as much as possible from the European American influence, to maintain their culture and social structure. And you've been fairly successful at it. Another group that has sought separation from American framework are select militant African American groups like the Black Panthers and the Black Muslims. Though neither group has enjoyed much support in the Black community, their separatist ideals have forced the federal government to tread lightly in dealing with race relations. Dominant groups do not always promote assimilation among its minority groups, but might attempt forced migration, expulsion, extermination, or genocide. All of these strategies were used against American Indians to a greater or lesser success. Expulsion, if you look at the East Coast and the Midwest to the Mississippi River, there are very few reservations east of the Mississippi River. And the reason is because of expulsion. They forced all of those tribes to move west, most of those tribes to move west. There are still some reservations in Wisconsin and in Michigan. The Choctaw still have they have a strong presence in Mississippi. The Cherokee, to some extent, are up in the mountains of in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina. But other than that, and these people, most of these people had to hide out. There's the Seminole in Florida who fought several wars against the American government, trying to maintain themselves in the Everglades of Florida. They are still there in that area. But other than that, there's not a whole lot of American Indians that were able to maintain themselves east of the Mississippi River. Most of them were moved out, and most of them were moved into areas that became Indian lands. Of course, it already belonged to somebody, but they moved them out there anyway. Nebraska became Indian territory, as did Kansas, and especially Oklahoma. Eventually, of course, Oklahoma was the only. Every place else had been settled by white settlers, and Oklahoma was the only Indian territory that was recognized. And of course, if you get into New Mexico and Arizona and Nevada and Utah, of course, they weren't actually dealing with the tribes at that time, but they excluded all of the most of the tribes that lived on the East Coast, and there were a lot of them. I guess there are still tribal lands up in upper New York State as well. Extermination, as sad as that is, this is a picture of Wounded Knee, of course. Genocide, this is a picture of the 7th Cavalry trying to exterminate actually the 7th Cavalry, that's the Washita River Massacre. Yeah, that's the Washita River Massacre up in Colorado. Immigration to the Americas was relatively slow in the beginning. The English controlled who could come in, and the possibility of hostility with American Indians made the move less attractive. This was in the 17th century. But after the colonies successfully revolted against the British monarchy and were able to stave off English assault in a second war from 1812 to 1815, the lure of free land and freedom from European politics looked more tempting. Immigration started in earnest in about 1820. Of course, free land wasn't the only lure for mass immigration into the United States. Mass industrialization in the United States began around 1820, and jobs awaited those coming in. They were leaving political persecution, religious intolerance, and primogeniture and inflexible class structures that made social mobility impossible. So most of the people coming to the United States were peasants, they were farmers, they were not wealthy people. They were people leaving bad situations and hoping for better situations in the United States. From 1820 to 1920, 5,500,000 immigrants came from Germany. 5 million. Now, the thing to understand about Germany is that it didn't exist as Germany until 1890. Before that, it was a bunch of little principalities, and each principality had a monarchy and an aristocracy. So if you lived in Germany, if you were German, then the probability is that you were a peasant. You were somebody that wasn't allowed to be educated. You lived in a very poor situation. So that's one of the reasons why so many Germans fled from the German areas. Sometimes your principality might have been controlled by the Swedes. Sometimes it might have been controlled by the Poles. Sometimes it might have been controlled by the Austrians. Sometimes it might have been controlled by the French or the Belgians or anybody. But there was no Germany. The only real Germany was in was up in the corner. I can't Bismarck. The Prussians, I'm sorry, the Prussians, and they lived over by Poland. Anyway, so that's a lot of people that came in, 5,500,000. So the Germans have the largest group of people to come into the United States, to immigrate to the United States from Europe, were Germans, even though Germany didn't exist until 1890. From 1820 to 1920, 4,400,000 immigrants came over from Ireland. Ireland is this little tiny place right over here. So what was going on in Ireland that so many people had to leave? Well, there was a potato famine. And the reason the potato famine occurred is because a fungus got into the potatoes and destroyed the crops. So people were starving to death. So a lot of people came over from Ireland to get away from starvation. And of course, when they came to the United States, one of the things that you should understand about the Irish is that the English don't like them. The English don't like the Irish, and the Irish don't like the English. And this was a problem. This was a really serious problem because they were leaving someplace where most of the people didn't like them, and they were moving to the United States where England dominated the politics of the time. So even to this day, there are people of English ancestry that really don't like the Irish. I was in Omaha, and of course, St. Patrick's Day. I'm pretty goofy, so I was wearing green just to honor, the Irish. I have very little Irish in me personally, but I wore green on a select day, and I'll tell you what, there were some people that were not happy with the fact that I was honoring the Irish because they disliked them so much. So that's just the way it works. So as you can see, the Irish were number 2. They had the second highest immigration to the United States. Between 1820 and 1920, 4,100,000 immigrants arrived from Italy. Most of these immigrants arrived between 1880 and 1920. So a lot of people came over from Italy. From 1820 to 1920, 3,700,000 immigrants came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which included Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, parts of Italy, Bohemia, Poland, and much of the Balkans. That was all owned by the Austrian Empire. From 1820 to 1920, 2,500,000 immigrants came over from England. Now, this is really kind of interesting because we think of the English as dominating, as being the dominant group in the United States, but they were only dominant in the very beginning. And then all of a sudden, when they opened up immigration to the United States after the Brits were kicked out, and the American, the United States opened up immigration, all of a sudden we got floods of Germans, we got floods of Irish. It was a long time before we got the flood of Italians, but boy, they really came in after 1880. The English, not so much. Only 2,500,000 immigrants between 1820 and 1920. From 1820 to 1920, 2 million Russian immigrants came to the United States. Mostly they were Ashkenazi Jews. Now, there are several different groups of Jews. The two main types are Ashkenazi, which are Eastern European Ashkenazi, and the Sephardic. The Sephardic Jews come from Spain and northern Africa. That's the Sephardic Jews are from there, and the Ashkenazi Jews are from Eastern Europe. Now, of course, all the entire Jewish population started out in Israel. It started out in that area, and then they were moved out by different groups. The Egyptians moved them out, the Assyrians moved them out, and they were forced to the Jewish diaspora started, and they went wherever they would be acceptable. And of course, Eastern Europe was one of the areas, and the other was Spain. They were accepted in Spain, and that's where the Sephardic Jews come from. And the Ashkenazi Jews are the Jewish people living in Eastern Europe, and they have different genetic structures to some extent. So they're not exactly the same. It's just kind of fascinating when you deal with this separate religion. 2 million Russians, and most of them were Jewish people. Now, why in the world? The Russians didn't want their people to immigrate to the United States. So why in the world did they allow the Jews to immigrate? Well, they allowed the Jews to immigrate because they didn't want them. They didn't like them. They forced them to live in ghettos. And from time to time, people would get upset for one reason or another, and they would go in and they would kill the Jewish population. They would attack them, and those were called pogroms in Eastern Europe, and this was fairly common in Russia and the Ukraine. So here's Russia over here. I haven't showed you where all these places are. There's Germany. Here's Ireland. There's Italy. This is the United Kingdom, of course. Okay, who's next? From 1820 to 1920, 1 million Swedish immigrants came to the United States. And this is Sweden right here. This pink-colored country is Sweden. From 1820 to 1920, 755,000 Norwegians immigrated to the United States. That's the blue country right here. This is Norway. For the longest time, these two countries were connected, Norway and Sweden. Sweden was dominant, had dominated Norway, and then at the turn of the 20th century, Norway broke away from Sweden. Are they the same? Don't ever... No, they're not. No, don't ever mix up the Norwegians and the Swedes. They do not like that at all. From 1820 to 1920, 570,000 Scots immigrated to the United States, and this is Scotland up here. This shows it as part of the United Kingdom. And the reason it's the United Kingdom is because this is England down here, and this is Scotland up here. This section of England is Wales, and I think we're going to talk about the Welsh in just a second. Anyway, 570,000 Scots came to the United States, mostly Presbyterians, as curious as that is. From 1820 to 1920, 550,000 immigrants from France came to the United States. Not so many. There's France right there, this huge country right there. They didn't really leave Ile-de-France because that is, they think that France is the best place in the world. Everybody thinks that their own country is the best place in the world. From 1820 to 1920, 350,000 Greek immigrants came to the United States, mostly in the 20th century. And Greece is right over here. Where are you, Greece? Where are you? Oh, there it is, right here. This is Greece. This is the Balkans. There was a lot of strange stuff has happened in the Balkans. Mainly because people couldn't get along with each other. Albania's here, and Bulgaria and Romania, Hungary, Serbia's over here. Anyway, a lot of problems in the Balkans. And the Greeks were part of that whole thing. Macedonians. But this is Greek, this brown area right here. From 1820 to 1920, 320,000 Turks immigrated to the United States. Mostly they're Armenians in the 20th century. Armenians, so who's an Armenian? The Kardashians are Armenians. That's why they're darker complected. That's the nasal structure that they have is fairly prominent, and that's an Armenian feature. Anyway, from 1820 to 1920, 255,000 immigrants came from to the United States from Switzerland. And where are you, Switzerland? Oh, here it is. Switzerland's right there. This tiny little place is Switzerland. Anyway, not so many. From 1820 to 1920, 210,000 immigrants arrived to the United States from Portugal, mostly as shepherds in the West and as laborers in Hawaii. And this is Portugal right here. From 1820 to 1920, 200,000 immigrants came to the United States from the Netherlands. Not so many. This is the Netherlands right here. That's the Netherlands, the brown country. This is Belgium. That's the Netherlands. 140,000 immigrants came from Belgium. And this is Belgium right here, this red country between Germany and France that got involved in both wars, both World War I and World War II. All the trenches in World War I were right through here, right on the Belgian border. 1820 to 1920, 130,000 immigrants from Spain came to the United States. And this is Spain, large country right there. From 1820 to 1920, 75,000 Welsh immigrants came to the United States. And as I told you, there's Wales right here. And there you go. It's separated. Scotland's the northern part. And England is the southern part. And Wales is the western part. They have their own language, Welsh. From 1820 to 1920, 60,000 immigrants came to the United States from Bulgaria. And Bulgaria is right there, this red country right here, right above Greece. From 1820 to 1920, 60,000 immigrants came from Romania to the United States. And this is Romania, this large area right here. You may know Romania by one of the areas in Romania is Transylvania. And of course, that's where vampires are supposed to come from. When immigration first began exploding in the United States in the 1820s, the economy was primarily agrarian, clustered on the East Coast with industrialization in its infancy. Slavery fueled the Southern economy. By 1920, the population had increased by 10 times, and the United States was the most productive industrial country in the world. Slavery, of course, had been overthrown in 1865. But initially, in 1820, when the mass of immigration started, actually, the massive immigration didn't start until 1880. It was primarily an East Coast agrarian society. So they needed to open up land. They needed to open up land for all these immigrants coming in. They were fueling the Industrial Revolution with cheap labor coming over from Europe. That's one of the reasons why immigration was not slowed down, or even they didn't even consider slowing down immigration. And the reason is because they needed the labor. By 1920, 25% of the American labor force was foreign-born. In some industries and parts of the country, foreign-born labor was not only the majority, but almost unanimous. Mining, steel manufacturing, garment industry, the meatpacking plants were mostly immigrant workers. This is what happened in meat packing areas. Chicago had a big meat packing area. Omaha did. Dubuque, Iowa, had large meat packing plants. Wichita, Kansas, had large immigrant populations. So if you go, even to this day, if you go to the south side of Omaha, where the meatpacking plants were, most of that area is still settled by, there's a German section, and there's an Irish section, and a Czech section, and a Slovakian section. It's really kind of interesting. But mining, steel manufacturing, the garment industry, so the steel manufacturing in Pittsburgh and in Gary, Indiana, all of these were manned by new immigrants coming into the United States, and the garment industry, of course. The Industrial Revolution began in Europe in the middle of the 18th century. In England, by the early part of the 19th century, the revolution had spread to all corners of Europe. The Industrial Revolution replaced manpower with machine power. Families working at home were no longer needed as machines took over the work. So what did these people do? These people who had been farmers before, who had been manufacturing things in their houses, what did they do? Well, they didn't have any work anymore. So the Industrial Revolution actually took their jobs away from them, and they needed to do something. They needed to get off the land. They immigrated to the United States. Agriculture became mechanized as well, throwing thousands of peasants off the land where they had labored for centuries. They didn't own the land. They were just laborers on the land, and that's just the way it worked. So when they started using, not tractors, of course, but they started using machinery to do the agriculture, they really cut the number of farm laborers that they needed. So they what did they do? They went to the cities trying to find work. If they couldn't find work, then they had to do something. They immigrated to the United States, to Canada, to Australia, to some place where they could find work. Peasants had no place to go but to seek work in urban areas. To make matters worse, new technology increased food production as new medical practices cut mortality. Populations, especially in urban areas, exploded. The first wave of immigration came to the United States beginning in 1820. Primarily, these immigrants came from heavily industrialized Western and Northern Europe, mostly from Germany, Ireland, and Britain. The second great wave of immigrants hit around 1880. Most of these immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe. Unlike the previous immigrants, who were mostly Protestant or at least spoke English, these immigrants had black hair, none spoke English, and they were either Catholic, Orthodox, or Jewish. So whereas the first wave of immigrants coming from Germany, Ireland, and Great Britain were primarily Protestant, and the Irish and the Brits were able to speak English, and German is actually, Anglo-Saxon, Anglo and Saxon are both German languages. So the English language is kind of a Germanic language. They were able to learn English fairly readily. Now, all of a sudden, we had people coming into the United States who not only didn't look like the people that were already there, brown-haired and blue-eyed and blonde-haired and whatnot. They not only didn't look alike, and they didn't go to the same church, but they had black hair, and they spoke a language that was very difficult to learn English from from Hungarian and from Bulgarian, from Greek and Italian, and the Jewish language was mostly Russian because they were coming in from Russia. And all these people had black hair. Now, why is that important? Well, that's important because it meant if you had black hair, that meant that you weren't Protestant. You're probably not Protestant. You're probably either Catholic, Orthodox, or Jewish. Now, the Orthodox Church, the Christian Church split about 1000 A.D. It split in half, and half of the Christian world became Orthodox, and the other half became Catholic. At that time, there were no Protestant religions at this point. So if they split in half, and the Orthodox Church became the Greek Orthodox Church, Greek Orthodox Church, and the Russian Orthodox Church, and the Serbian Orthodox Church, and the Catholic Church, of course, became the Roman Catholic Church. So a lot of these individuals coming in the 1880s up to the 1920s, these individuals were not the same as the people that were coming in before. Western and Northern Protestant Europeans, the English, the Germans, Norwegians, Swedes, Welsh, French, Dutch, and Danes, similar to the dominant culture of the time. In fact, of the 204 founding fathers who signed the Declaration of Independence, all were Protestant except for 3 Catholics. So of the people that signed, who were initially the ones that led the revolution, 201 of them were Protestant, and the only 3 were Catholic. Part of the connection had to do with a cultural concept referred to as Protestant ethic, stressing hard work, success, and individualism. Because of the similarities between the revolutionary founders and the first immigrants, the people in the dominant culture in the United States were able to maintain racial, religious ethnocentrism into the 20th century. And this is one of the reasons, it may be really confusing to you. What in the world is going on with this white Aryan brotherhood and the Ku Klux Klan and all of that? But a lot of this had to do with the fact that a lot of people coming into the United States at the turn of the 20th century were not Protestant. They were different. They had black hair. They had a darker complexion than all of these people from northern Europe and western Europe. They looked different. They had black hair instead of brown hair or blonde hair or red hair. And this is kind of a big deal as far as these people are concerned. I mean, it's still creating friction to this day. The Western and Northern Europeans came from countries that were just as developed as the United States, so their immigrants were just as educated, they were just as skilled, and they were just as wealthy as the people that were already here. While a degree of prejudice, rejection, and discrimination existed with the new immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, integration took place fairly smoothly compared to other groups. Many of these new immigrants left the cities and moved onto farms in the fertile valleys of the Midwest, in Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, into Iowa, Kansas. They moved into farms, and of course they developed farming communities in these areas. Immigrants from Ireland and Southern and Eastern Europe weren't so lucky. Except for the Irish, these immigrants did not speak English. Some wrote with the Cyrillic alphabet, which the alphabet that we use in the United States is a Roman alphabet. The Cyrillic alphabet is the Russian alphabet. Their countries were not as developed as the United States, so they arrived with little or no education, rare skills, and no money to establish themselves. Education was not universal in Europe. So most of these people couldn't read, they couldn't write, and some of them if they could read, it was in a different alphabet. So I mean, it was really kind of a difficult situation for them. Their religion was not Protestant, of course. They weren't Episcopalian or Methodist or Baptist um, or Lutheran. They were something else. They were Jewish. They were Greek Orthodox. Um, they were Catholic. These immigrants were less likely to have the resources to buy land, and by the 1880s, most of the good farmland was gone anyway. They teamed into the cities looking for any labor they could find. They became the pawns of the industrial and mining revolution and were often exploited because of their lack of education and English language skills. It often took 2 generations for these immigrants to gain the education and language skills to advance beyond the most unskilled of labors. Social barriers, prejudice, and systematic discrimination became commonplace for the members of this group that didn't really dissipate until the middle of the 20th century. This is until World War II. They were acceptable then because they were used as soldiers, but before that they were discriminated against. Italians, Greeks. And if you watch a war movie from that was actually made during World War II, a lot of times they'll talk about this. They'll talk about the Greeks. They'll talk about the Italians and how they're just as good as everybody else, by golly. And one of the reasons they're saying this is because they needed them to help fight the war. Eastern European Jewish immigration peaked from 1880 to 1920, as only then were they allowed to leave Russia without paying huge sums to the government. In other words, they had to bribe their way out of the country. But then in 1880, immigration opened up in Russia. They allowed them to leave. Jews were barred from farming in Eastern Europe, so moving into the urban centers of the Northeast seemed natural for them. They weren't allowed to grow food. They had to buy food if they lived in Eastern Europe. And there were large populations of Jewish people living in Ukraine, in Russia, in Hungary, in Bulgaria. Large populations, and they weren't allowed to leave until the 1880s. 2/3 of the male immigrants were tailors or other skilled laborers when they came to the United States. That's all they could do. That's all they were allowed to do in Europe, so that was their skill. Because they weren't allowed to participate in commerce in the old country, they were forced to develop social institutions that were exclusively Jewish. When they arrived in the United States, they used these skills to open businesses and succeed in banking as well as other areas of endeavor. Because of the rampant persecution Jewish people had always known in Europe, they were accustomed to creating networks within their own communities. They were able to finance each other's businesses and provide inexpensive labor through religious connections. Because of their ability to succeed within their own community, Jewish immigrants were able to achieve economic solvency and success before they were Americanized. It may not make any sense to you. Why in the world were they picking on Jewish people? It was the oddest thing that happened. The Christian Church, which was both the Orthodox and Catholic Church were together at this time, had to decide who were the bad guys. Who killed Jesus was the question, and so they had to decide who it was going to be. Well, since they were going to build the church, the headquarters in Rome, they had to decide whether it was the Romans were the bad guys or whether the Jewish people were the bad guys. Well, I mean, logically, it should be the guys that actually killed Jesus to be who would be the bad guys. But since they needed Rome to be part of the Christian world, they decided that they would make Jewish people the villains in the story of who killed Jesus. And because of that, and because they read religious tracts literally, they decided that Jewish people from time to time needed to be punished. And the way they did this was by killing them, by running them out of town, by stealing all their money. And that happened from the beginning of Christianity, which happened at 0 years, until into the 20th century. I mean, this is one of the reasons that the Nazis persecuted the Jewish people and tried to exterminate the Jewish people was because of this long-standing hatred that Christianity had for Jewish people. And it may not make any sense to you, and it really doesn't make any sense unless you understand the history. But that's one of the things that happened in the United States. So because because it was different in the United States, because um, the the social structure was in turmoil so constantly in the United States. Jewish people moved to the same area. Nobody really cared because people were everything was in turmoil. People were moving around, so they weren't persecuted in the United States like they were like they were in Europe. They weren't murdered in the streets like they were in Europe. So it became a haven for Jewish people. And as well, I guess we're not going to really talk about it, but there are more Jewish people living in the United States than there are living in Israel today. So, I mean, that's one of the things that you have to think about. So, the United States became a haven for them. There were other places that they weren't allowed to go, like Canada doesn't have a very large Jewish population. Australia doesn't have a very large Jewish population. Why? Because their social structure was completely different from what it was in the United States. We were just looking for laborers. We didn't really care whether they were Greek or Orthodox or Italian. It didn't really matter. They could be Spanish. They could be Portuguese. We just needed labor in the United States. So when Jewish people came into the United States, we gave them jobs. It's like it was this mass. It was just a mess. Because of the history of scholarship among the Jewish people, these individuals took advantage of free public schools in the Northeast. Colleges in this area were also inexpensive or free, and second and third generation Jewish students took advantage of this boon. Jewish scholars were so successful that many Eastern colleges put a quota on the number of Jewish students they would admit. Almost any group that came to the United States who weren't white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant met with prejudice and discrimination when trying to assimilate into the fabric of the United States society. The Irish were disliked because they were Catholic, the English hated them, and they came in as poor. And why did they come in as poor? They came in as poor because Ireland was under the thumb of the English, and the Irish weren't allowed to own land in Ireland. So there were no rich Irish people coming into the United States. They all came in poor. Strangely, people thought that the Knights of Columbus were a military arm of the Catholic Church who were amassing arms in the KFC halls to overthrow the government. Knights of Columbus halls. And of course, even into the 20th century, people were talking about the Knights of Columbus. You can't trust them. That kind of stuff. It's stupid stuff like that. Anti-Semitism has been around in Europe since the advent of the Church in Rome. The infamous Spanish Inquisition was first organized to root out Jewish converted backsliders who had returned to their Jewish rituals. Anti-Semitism in the United States has been far less frequent and virulent. Anti-immigrant groups like the KKK tended to target Catholics as well as Jews. Famous Americans preached anti-Semitic messages, including Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh, and Father Charles Coughlin, who was Catholic. Jewish immigrants came to be connected with communist organizations, and one hate drifted into the other. My own aunt was an evangelist, and she was an evangelist in the 1920s. And that's one of the ways my family got through the Great Depression was she would have tent revivals and they would collect money. But one of the ways that she preached her gospel was anti-Semitic. She was an anti-Semitic. She was an anti-Semitic until the day she died. my my aunt was so crazy that she hated the fact that Israel was a country, and every time there was an Arab-Israeli war, she would root for the Arabs to win because she thought that Israel needed to be overthrown. That's how crazy she was. Luckily, of course, my parents thought she was a wacko. So anyway, so Henry Ford was a anti-Semitic. Charles Lindbergh, the first man to fly across the Atlantic Ocean solo, and this is Father Coughlin. Father Coughlin is this guy right here. This is Henry Ford, looking at his Model T Ford engine, or Model A Ford actually. Yeah, that's Charles Lindbergh, and this is Father Coughlin. He was real popular. He was on the radio in the 1920s and 1930s, and he was so popular because he was anti-Semitic. And then World War II started, and all of a sudden they just shut those guys down. Well, by that time, Henry Ford was dead. Charles Lindbergh shut up, and Father Coughlin was taken off the radio. And my aunt, the the federal government came in and told her to shut up, stop preaching that dumb stuff. Anyway, and she did. She stopped. The anti-immigrant movement actually began as greater and greater numbers of immigrants began coming into the United States in 1820. So this is the anti-immigrant movement. The movement took hold as a nativist group trying to control the influx of Irish Catholics coming into the United States. Eventually, these anti-immigrant organizations would form a political party called the Know Nothing Party. Yeah, let's start a party called the Know Nothing Party. We just hate Irish people. We just hate Catholics. Different organizations would take the lead on opposing immigration after the Know Nothings dissolved during the Civil War. The Ku Klux Klan and the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, became leaders in anti-immigration. The KKK opposed new immigration because the people coming in were undesirables. They were Catholic, they were Jewish, they were people that didn't look like everybody else. They wore beards, they had funny clothes. They didn't look cute like these guys down here. During the height of the Ku Klux Klan's power in the 1920s, the National Origins Act was passed stopping most immigration into the United States. A second National Origins Act was passed the next year, setting quotas on any and all immigration. Immigration from Asia was stopped completely in 1924 with the National Origins Act. Immigration from 1924 to 1965, when the National Origins Act was rescinded, was the lowest in U.S. history. Acculturation into the American framework tends not to be very rapid. Immigrants often take 2, 3, or even 4 generations for total integration. Even European immigrants who didn't have to overcome racial prejudice and discrimination didn't really assimilate into the United States framework for generations. Often the integration process lasted into the late 20th century. European immigrants tended to land in East Coast cities, especially New York, and moved immediately into ethnic neighborhoods. They were around other people who spoke the same language and had the same customs. Their ties were to families and neighborhoods, and they only left to work. First-generation immigrants usually lived and died in this old world context. In other words, they never had to learn English. The fathers may have worked, but of course they were looking for laborers that they didn't have to pay very much money to, and they didn't need to learn to speak English. Second-generation immigrants lived marginal existences, partially in the old world, speaking their parents' native tongue with their parents and other people in their neighborhoods. and partially in the American world where they spoke English and were educated and socialized into the Anglo-American culture. They lived old world values and tended to subordinate themselves to their parents. Marriages were either arranged or approved by parents, which certainly clashed with American ideals of individualism and romantic love. They were sometimes limited by discriminatory practices, but tended to move out of their old neighborhoods and seek upward mobility. A good example would be My Big Fat Greek Wedding. If you've ever seen that movie, that's very similar to what was happening to second generation immigrants. Third generation or grandchildren of immigrants tended to be raised in non-ethnic settings. They rarely learned any language than English, and their mindset was purely American. Interaction with the old world culture only took place during reunions, births, weddings, and funerals. The experience of Italian American males is demonstrative of the experiences of many European immigrants. Only 21.9% of the first generation Italian immigrants married outside the ethnicity. By the third generation, 67.3% married outside the ethnicity. Ethnic succession is the pattern of improved status of one group of immigrants as new immigrants arrive from more denigrated areas. As ethnic groups change from first generation to second generation, the improved assimilation and influx of new immigrants from less desirable locales made the first group more acceptable. As Northern and Western Europeans moved up and vacated jobs, Irishmen tended to move in. The Irish were in turn replaced by the Italians and Poles. Links were forged between ethnic groups and political bosses circulating around the work areas. Immigrant leaders joined the political structure and began maintaining political power of their own through bribes, payoffs, and cronyism. And if you watch a movie from the 1950s, like On the Waterfront, this is exactly what's happening On the Waterfront. Terence Powderly founded the first labor union in 1869. The first labor union was an offshoot of the Knights of Columbus and in fact was named the Knights of Labor. Irishmen like Powderly began pushing for improved conditions and equitable wages, and soon one-third of all labor unions were headed by Irishmen. Another famous labor organizer was Irish-born Mary Mother Jones, who worked primarily organizing miners. Mother Jones was arrested several times for agitation, but she rarely spent very long in prison because of her age and her prestige. She was not afraid of the richest robber baron or the President of the United States. And here she is with Calvin Coolidge, Mother Jones. There's a magazine that honors Mother Jones. It's called Mother Jones, of course. The Irish were the first Catholic European immigrants, and because of this, dominated the Catholic Church in the United States for well over 100 years. Since the Catholic faith is practiced in different ways in different countries, friction began when Italian and Polish Catholics began encroaching on the Irish Catholic domain. Friction became so intense that Polish and Italian congregants refused to attend Irish Catholic services, and separate dioceses had to be established to support the different views of Catholicism. And this is what I was talking about when I was talking about Omaha. They had 5 or 6 different dioceses in Omaha, mainly because the Italian Catholics didn't want to have anything to do with the Irish Catholics, who didn't want to have anything to do with the Polish Catholics, who didn't want to have any things to do with the Czech Catholics or the Slovakian Catholics. Just bizarre stuff that somebody from there's only one church, the Methodist Church, really didn't make a lot of sense to me. I'm not the brightest bulb in the bunch. Of course, there are always illegitimate pathways towards success and acceptance in any society. There are ways blocked by WASP society. New immigrants sometimes found their way to success in the form of criminal behavior and organized crime. And organized crime, if you've ever seen the Gangs of New York with Leonardo DiCaprio and what is that guy's name? Anyway, really good movie. It shows you how criminal groups organized crime started way, way back. It didn't start with prohibition in the 1920s. It started, it started, or in 1919, when prohibition started. It started way, way back. It's been around forever. Crime became especially lucrative for new immigrants during Prohibition when their old world contacts helped them smuggle alcohol into the United States. Jewish and Italian immigrants took the lead in such organizations, with Italian immigrants gaining a stronger foothold because of their connections to the mafia in Italy, and actually in Sicily, not in Italy. However, Prohibition and later drug smuggling with Hispanic connections was only the most visible organized crime in the United States history. Before the Jewish and Italian domination of early 20th century alcohol smuggling, Irish and German immigrants dominated organized crime. At one point, Irish gangs started the draft riots in New York City during the Civil War that saw hundreds of African Americans murdered in the streets. Sports were another avenue to acceptance for minority people. Early baseball and football was dominated by second and third generation immigrants. Boxing was another venue where immigrants excelled in succession. The Irish first, then Jewish people, then Italian athletes, and now Russians. As industrialization continued in the United States through the 19th and 20th centuries, one more factor became obvious: structural mobility. Structural mobility deals with the continued mechanization and automation of industry. Education became more and more important in the workplace as unskilled jobs disappeared and the manufacturing jobs began disappearing as well. Education was a luxury for the wealthy until the early 20th century. Only about 20% of children entering school ever graduated with a high school diploma. This was at the beginning of the 20th century. The GI Bill after World War II afforded immigrants the financial backing to go to school without starving to death. The GI Bill and the new educational opportunities for second and third generation immigrants really changed the upward mobility for these individuals. This phenomena, plus the movement of people into the suburbs, tended to break up the ethnic neighborhoods that had been founded before World War II. As we have seen, the first European settlers who came to the United States were mostly English with some German and Dutch. The groups that had the easiest time assimilating to life in the New World were groups with the most similarity to the original settlers, Northern and Western European. Now, there's a reason why I'm not talking about the Spanish in the Southwest. And the reason I'm not talking about the Spanish in the Southwest is because the Southwest wasn't really conquered, wasn't really dominated by the United States until just before the Civil War. So that's one of the reasons why I'm not talking about the Spanish. And primarily, the Spanish just moved back down south. They moved south of the border to Mexico and into Central and South America. The Spanish that stayed in into what became the United States were mostly in New Mexico, some in Arizona, not very many, but in California, especially Southern California. As immigrants drifted farther and farther away from being white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant, the harder it became for them to assimilate smoothly into the American fabric. However, another factor to acceptance had to do with more unacceptable groups coming in. The Irish were more acceptable than the Italians. Religion became, and this is the way it worked. I mean, the English didn't like the Irish, but at least they liked them better than they liked the Italians. Then the English and the Irish didn't like the Italians, but at least they liked them better than the Hungarians and the Bulgarians that were coming in. And they didn't like them. And then different groups came into the United States, and suddenly these people became more and more acceptable. Religion became a huge factor in acceptance and rejection of immigrants. One sociological study from the 1940s looked at the marriage patterns of immigrants in the Northeast. At this point, ethnicity and religion afforded boundaries for marriage. Everyone married within their religion and their ethnic structure. So if you were Irish, you married an Irish girl. If you were Catholic, you married a Catholic girl. If you were Italian, you certainly didn't marry anybody but another Italian. And of course, the Greeks, of course, they were Greek Orthodox, and they certainly wouldn't marry a Catholic. The longer people were in the United States, the less strict the boundaries that were seen. Religion continued to be an important factor in mate selection, but ethnicity became less important. Research in the 1950s found that while pressure continued for assimilation, the pressure to change religions was uncommon. Over the years, religions other than Protestants were persecuted in the United States. Mormons were hounded from one settlement to the next until they finally settled in Utah. The reality is that the Mormon church started in Palmyra, New York. Started in New York State. They were hounded and moved from New York to Nauvoo in Illinois, and from Nauvoo they went to Omaha. They were moved out of Omaha, and they eventually ended up in Utah. And that's one of the reasons why Utah has such a large Mormon population. They were moved out of different areas, one way or the other. Sometimes it was open warfare. They burned their houses. They chased them out. Catholics were thought to be amassing arms for a government takeover in the 19th and 20th centuries. As a matter of fact, my crazy evangelist aunt preached that the Knights of Columbus were amassing arms in the basement of the Knights of Columbus Hall. This was in the 1920s, so there were still these ideas that Catholics were amassing to take over the United States, as odd as that seems. Jewish people, and this is one of the reasons why they wanted to stop immigration at the beginning of the 20th century, because of crazy evangelists like my aunt and like Father Coughlin. Well, not Father Coughlin, he was Catholic, but she was preaching against. She was anti-Semitic. She was anti-Catholic. There were Protestant ministers that were swearing that these people were trying to take over the United States. Jewish people were at the forefront of liberalization and union movements in the United States and were considered communists by many after World War II. In Europe, social class is very important, developing from the aristocratic structure that permeated most European social structures prior to the 18th century. Since most immigrants in the 18th and 19th centuries were of European origin, social class became an important factor to the people coming into the United States. So money and social position have always been important in the United States to this white population. Most people not only socialized within their ethnic and social class, but they married within it as well. Since most immigrants came into the United States as workers in the working class, this division of labor made it difficult for them to acculturate until they could throw off this social stigma of being a worker. Since European countries are patriarchal, immigrants coming to the United States from Europe tended to accept the female subordinate mindset. The religion, all of the Catholic religion and Protestant religions are also patriarchal, and they also consider the female subordinate. For this reason, the experiences of female immigrants tended to be muted. In truth, in many cases, husbands came to the United States first to secure a living before sending for his family. In some ways, it was easier for women to acculturate and integrate into the American society. Irish women had little difficulty finding work as domestics. This trend continued through the 1920s. While this type of employment worked for Irish women, Italian patriarchal strictures prevented Italian females from working in close proximity to strange men. So Italian teenage women couldn't find jobs as domestics, but the Irish could. Jewish women had different experiences. Jewish families tended to immigrate to the United States intact. Young unmarried daughters were expected to work until they were married. They tended to work in the garment industry in their neighborhoods for Jewish factory owners. Not everyone who immigrated to the United States planned to make the United States their permanent home. These individuals are referred to as sojourners. The Chinese came to the United States to make money so that they could return to China. Many Italians came to the United States with the same mindset. Between 1899 and 1924, 3,800,000 Italians came to the United States, but in the same time period, 2,100,000 went back to Italy. The individuals were sojourners. They didn't plan to move permanently to the United States. This is the largest ancestor. This is as of 2000. The light blue are Germans, and you can see how many Germans there are. So if you live in Pennsylvania, wow, geez, the whole state's German. Ohio, the same thing. Cincinnati, Hudepohl beer, the Queen City is Cincinnati. It was a German town. It was Germantown. Okay, this is Indiana. This is my home state. There's my county right there. That one right there. That blue one right there. Mostly Germans. So I went to school with a lot of Brandenburgs. A lot of people with German names, German and English names. What's the yellow? American. Okay. Okay. A lot of people lost their ancestry and they didn't know what it was. So in 2000, when they filled out the census, they just put American because they had no idea what their ancestry was. And this happened a lot in the South, especially in Appalachia. Now, the interesting thing about Appalachia is that a lot of these people, coal mining was big, but there were a lot of people there. So a lot of them moved up to the industrial north. And one of the areas they moved to was my hometown. I'm from Muncie, Indiana. Muncie used to have 5 or 6 different factories. They made automobile parts, and for that reason, a lot of people from eastern Kentucky and eastern Tennessee moved to Muncie so that they could find work. Not important. Okay, so what are we looking at? The green is Scandinavian or Norwegian. Okay, Norwegian. Ufta. Okay. And then the yellow is American. Oh, these are the reservations. Okay, I used to work at Fort Belknap. That's in Blaine County right here. And this is Fort Peck, and this is the Blackfoot Reservation, and this is the Flathead Reservation, Salish and Kootenai. These guys are Cheyenne, and these guys are Crow. There you go. These are all Sioux, Lakota and Nakota primarily. And the guys down south are in the Dakota. Okay. The Cherokee, Choctaw in eastern Oklahoma. And there you guys are. There you go. These 3 counties, primarily Navajo counties. Well, one of them is Navajo County. One of them is Apache County. This one's Apache County. Okay. Anyway. Okay, so you can see where most people are. Mostly Germans. Lots and lots and lots of Germans, as you can see. Today, it is difficult to find any European immigrants who aren't completely assimilated. Even groups who suffered from rejection and discrimination are integrated and have intermarried into older families. By 1990, 56% of all married whites had spouses whose ethnic backgrounds did not match their own. And that's exactly what happened to me. My first wife was primarily, what was she? Oh, she was, anyway, I'm not sure what she was. Okay, I think she was Western European and English, just like I was. Wait a minute. Okay, so that's what's going on in 1990 into the 2000s, into the 21st century. Yeah, okay, but you go back 2 or 3 generations, and these guys were new immigrants into the United States. So the people that persecuted the indigenous peoples of the Americas Um, the people, the Kit Carsons that moved the Dene people to Bosque Redondo, those they are a minority of the people in the United States. Most of the white people you run into, except for me probably, they have only been into the United States for maybe 100 years. My family came in the 17th century. They settled in Salem, in Salem, Massachusetts, and strangely enough, in Salem, New Jersey. And there's still Bradways in Salem, New Jersey. They came in as some of them came in as Quakers, some of them came in as Baptists. Anyway, my family's been here for a long time, so you can blame me if you like. I have two ancestors who were presidents, the Adams boys, John and John Quincy. Were both relatives of mine. So you can blame me if you want to blame somebody for all the nasty stuff white people have done. In 1952, Marcus Hansen said, what the second generation tries to forget, the third generation tries to remember. What Hansen was referring to was that while second generation immigrants sought assimilation and thus the rejection of their birth culture, the third generation embraced their culture and tried to recapture it. This Hansen referred to as ethnic revival. And of course, who knows who this guy is? This is in New York City. And I'm guessing, maybe he's an urban Indian, maybe. Who knows? Anyway, I'm guessing that's not traditional. And that is the end of the chapter. So there you go. Don't forget, your discussion has to do with coming up with a synopsis of a different indigenous group, primarily in the United States, can be Canada, I guess. Could be Alaska, that's part of the United States. Anyway, so there you go. That's what white people are. They're probably not as homogenous as you think they are, because a lot of people come from different places, a lot of different places, and sometimes they maintain part of their culture. Um, like I said, I was wearing green on St. Patrick's Day, and I got a bunch of people who claimed to be English and Scottish, who were really upset with me. So if people have that degree of memory of their own ethnicity, well, good for that. Good for them. Too bad that it takes in negative ideas. So what happened with all these Germans, and why in the world don't these Germans? They change. Sometimes they change their name. What happened? What happened to them? Well, during World War One, there was an upheaval. There was a backlash against Germans, and you can see all the Germans in the United States. So the people with German names, they were forced to change their name. If their name was Schneider or Müller, they changed their name to Snyder and Miller. It's just what was going on at that time. And then, of course, World War II, we were fighting against the Nazis. They were another, Germans again. So a lot of these Germans lost lost whatever cultural identity they had. So there you go. But you go to Pella, Iowa, and you can walk up into a windmill, a Dutch windmill, and same thing in Fulton, Iowa, or Fulton, Illinois, right across the Mississippi from Clinton. Anyway, so a lot of people have lost their ethnicity, but there are still some white populations that maintain it. It's just the Germans that have lost their identity. My family was English, and we were actually Huguenots. Huguenots were a Protestant religious group that were kicked out of France in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And so some of my ancestors were these Huguenots. Well, Huguenots don't exist anymore, but I do have French and German and English ancestry. Anyway, I'll talk to you guys next week.